The shell collector's secret. The mortar was still damp. That was the first thing, the impossible thing that struck the eye in the dimness. The rest of the folly was centuries of slow decay and careful, loving preservation, smelling of salt and old lime and the memory of the sea. But here, in the very deepest and darkest alcove of the grotto, the scent was sharp, flat, gray, and modern. Portland cement, a hasty wall built where no wall should be. And behind it, waiting in the terrible dark, lay the unmistakable stillness of something that had stopped breathing days ago. Reginald Haverly had built this magnificent place over 12 long years to house beauty. Now, in the end, it housed him. Hello, and welcome to Midnight Pages. I'm David, your host, here with you from Ohio. Tonight's story is about the things we build to protect ourselves, the obsessive collections we curate, and the things we are willing to destroy when those protections fail. Have you ever spent years of your life creating something, only to realize in one sickening moment that it was built upon a fatal flaw? Tell me in the comments below. We are traveling tonight to the gray, salt-battered Devon coast in the early spring of 1953, where a masterpiece of eccentricity and obsession hides a very quiet, very desperate crime. Now, let us step out of the biting wind and step inside the grotto. Chapter 1. What the Grotto Kept. The European common periwinkle, known to science as Littorina littorea, is not a shell that commands a price in any auction house. It is the humblest, commonest of things, carpeting the rock pools of the English coast in their millions. It is small, heavy-shelled, ridged and whorled in shades of gray and dark olive brown, clinging tenaciously to the wet stones against the pull of the tide. It costs absolutely nothing. To a serious collector, it is entirely worthless. It does not gleam, it catches no eye, it is the thing everyone overlooks. Yet it is the bedrock of the shore. It was the very first shell Reginald Haverly ever picked up, as a curious boy of 8, on a freezing Cornish beach 50 years ago. That was why, set into a solitary brass pin at the very entrance of his magnificent grotto, there sits a single, unremarkable periwinkle. It is the ordinary thing that escapes notice, which is, of course, where everything truly begins. The morning air at Thornwick Hall was sharply, unforgivingly cold. It was the kind of early spring morning where the winter still held the earth in a vice, carrying the salt-heavy, metallic scent of the Devonshire coast on a wind that cut straight through heavy wool. The light was a pale, watery silver, washing over the imposing facade of the great house and casting long, cold shadows across the dormant lawns. Miss Jane Marple pulled her thick-knitted cardigan tighter around her shoulders as she stepped carefully from the passenger side of Dr. Elspeth Murray's sturdy motor car, the crunch of the tires on the drive giving way to the sharp, rhythmic sound of their sensible shoes on the gravel. She had come to Thornwick as a guest, a quiet companion to her old friend on the doctor's morning medical rounds. Dr. Murray, a woman of formidable, unsentimental practicality, who wore tweed skirts that seemed utterly impervious to the weather, was the consulting physician who attended Reginald Haverly's severe arthritis. "He's a gentle soul, Reginald is," Murray had said on the drive over the winding coastal roads, her gloved hands resting firmly on the steering wheel, her eyes on the treacherous curves. "Not a wealthy man in the way you might think. The estate is comfortable enough, but his real fortune, his life's blood, is entirely wrapped up in his collection. He spends his life in that absurd grotto of his, down by the water. And his niece, Isabel, who lives with him, she is quite devoted to the work. A true artist with the shells, from what I gather." Miss Marple had listened, her blue eyes mild and observant. The letters she had received from Elspeth over the past few months had mentioned Isabel's talent for shell work, in terms that had given Miss Marple, without her quite knowing why, an odd, prickling feeling of unease. It was not that talent itself was suspect, but there was something in the intensity of it, the absolute isolation of the uncle and niece, on this sprawling, windswept coastal estate that reminded her of a situation in St. Mary Mead involving an antique restorer who had been a little too devoted to his craft to the detriment of his own sanity. But as they walked up the gravel drive, flanked by heavy stone urns that were empty of life, they were not greeted by Isabel. They were met by Reuben, the estate's elderly gardener. The man was trembling violently, his weathered hands gripping his flat cloth cap so tightly his knuckles were white as chalk. His face was the color of old parchment. "Dr. Murray," he gasped, stumbling forward. "Thank God you're here. Thank God." "Reuben, what is it?" Dr. Murray asked sharply, reaching out to steady the older man. "Has Mr. Haverly had a fall?" He did not answer directly. He did not lead them to the grand front door of the house. Instead, he turned and gestured frantically past the dormant frosted gardens, down the steep sloping lawn, toward the coastal cliffs, where the imposing stone Folly stood against the gray sky like a small fortress. "I sealed that section last week," Reuben stammered, his voice thinning out in the wind, catching in his throat as they hurried down the uneven dirt path. "Miss Isabel's orders, doctor." "Mr. Reginald wanted it done before the spring," she said. "He wanted the damp kept out. But this morning, I came down to check the damp. I brought a lantern. There's a crack in the mortar, doctor. And a smell. It's not a grotto smell. It's something else." The grotto was an astonishing structure, built directly into the natural limestone of the cliff, and expanded outward with heavy stone blocks. Its interior was encrusted with tens of thousands of shells, arranged in sweeping, magnificent mosaics that usually caught the breath of anyone who entered. But Reuben did not look at the beauty of the place. He pointed with a shaking, soil-stained finger to a recessed sealed alcove near the very back wall, where the shadows were deepest and the air was dead. Miss Marple stepped inside, the frigid air of the Folly biting at her cheeks like needles. The smell hit her instantly, a heavy, sweet, terrible scent that lay beneath the natural odor of salt and dried seaweed. She stood very still, her eyes adjusting to the profound gloom, the intricate shell panels swimming into focus around her. She looked at the sealed wall. The mortar here was starkly, blatantly different from the rest of the grotto. The original walls, which she could see arching overhead in triumphant curves, were bound in a cream-colored lime putty, a slow-setting traditional mixture glittering with crushed shell aggregate that caught what little light managed to penetrate the entrance. This new section was entirely different. She stepped closer, removing her right glove. She ran her bare fingers along the original wall. It was rough, porous, slightly chalky to the touch. Then she reached out and ran her fingers across the mortar of the newly sealed alcove. It was Portland cement, gray, perfectly smooth, utilitarian, and fast-setting. It was cold and hard as iron. It had been done in a frantic hurry. She noted the stark contrast in color, the bright, warm cream against the dead, flat gray. It was a violent intrusion on the aesthetic of the space. She said nothing, slipping her glove back on, but she filed the observation away in her neat, precise mind. The H, she thought, as she watched the gardener step back, shivering. H for Haverly, F for Folly. The discrepancy was glaring, an ugly scar on a beautiful face. When the local police arrived an hour later, the quiet, isolated estate was instantly transformed into a theater of harsh, practical action. The crunch of heavy tires, the slamming of car doors, the sharp barking of orders shattered the coastal peace. Inspector Chard of the County Constabulary strode into the grotto, bringing the atmosphere of the station house with him. He was a solid, methodical man who moved heavily, entirely focused on the practical realities of the situation. His boots echoed loudly against the stone floor. He was not an unimaginative man, but he dealt in hard, undeniable facts. He looked at the sealed wall, flashed his heavy electric torch over the crack Reuben had reported, and grimaced at the smell. "Break it down," Chard ordered, gesturing to the two young constables holding heavy iron pickaxes. He did not notice the difference between the Portland cement and the lime putty. He only saw a wall that needed to come down. Miss Marple watched quietly from the arched entrance as the heavy, deafening blows echoed through the beautiful, fragile chamber. The gray mortar cracked, webbing like broken glass, then crumbled outward in heavy chunks. The rough stones were pulled away, clattering to the floor. Behind the hasty wall, seated awkwardly in a small, damp recess that had once been meant for a classical statue, was Reginald Haverly. He was dead, slumped forward, his hands resting in his lap. And from the heavy, terrible stillness of the air that rushed out of the tomb, he had been dead for several days. Chapter 2. The Collector's Passion. The tiger cowrie, Cypraea tigris, is the shell that makes ordinary people into collectors. It is heavily rounded, perfectly smooth, polished to a breathtaking porcelain sheen by the animal's own living mantle that wraps completely around it in life. It is patterned with deep, dark, leopard-like spots over a pale, creamy ground. It is beautiful, widely collected, and not exceptionally rare. A good specimen might be had for 5 to 50 pounds. But it is a profound lesson in the pure appeal of surface beauty. It is the first impression that teaches the human eye what perfection in a natural object is supposed to mean, drawing the viewer in entirely on the strength of its flawless, untouchable exterior. The house was terribly quiet, filled with the heavy, muffled silence of a place that has absorbed a profound shock and does not yet know how to settle itself back into the rhythms of normal life. Miss Marple and Dr. Murray, seeking a quiet place away from the heavy boots of the police constables in the hall, found themselves in Reginald Haverly's private collection room on the ground floor. It was a staggering space. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with glass-fronted mahogany cabinets, each one softly lit to display thousands of shells mounted on black velvet. Miss Marple walked slowly past the displays, her eyes moving over the vibrant, impossible architectures of the sea. There were murex shells bristling with terrifying, delicate spines, heavy, lustrous abalones gleaming with mother-of-pearl, fragile, paper-thin argonauts that looked as though a breath might shatter them. She paused before the cone shell case. 40 distinct specimens were arranged meticulously by size, from the smallest at the top left to the largest at the bottom right. Each shell rested on a precisely cut white foam mount, and below each was a small cream-colored card bearing its scientific name in Reginald's careful copperplate handwriting. Further along the wall was the cowrie case, dominating the room with the tiger cowries in all their spotted magnificence. But it was at the far end of the room that the true heart of the collection lay. Behind heavily reinforced glass stood a locked, freestanding case containing the glory of the sea, Conus gloriameris. It was the most valuable shell in the entire room, resting gently in a bespoke velvet cradle, softly illuminated by a small, dedicated brass lamp. "He lived for this room, Jane," Dr. Murray said quietly, standing before a central display table. She picked up one of several leather-bound notebooks resting there. She opened it, running a gloved finger down the neat, cramped handwriting. "Look at this. Every specimen catalogued, where it was found, the dealer he bought it from, the exact price paid, the condition. It's meticulous. It's the work of a man completely consumed by his passion." Miss Marple looked over her friend's shoulder at the ledger. The entries were exhaustive, written in the steady hand of a man who found order deeply comforting. "He loved them," Miss Marple murmured, "not just for their rarity, Elspeth, but for their forms. The grotto was simply an extension of this room, an attempt to live inside the collection itself." Their quiet reflection was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Daggett, the housekeeper, carrying a silver tray with a pot of strong, hot tea. She was a stout woman of 62, who had been with the Haverleys for 20 years. She set the tray down on a side table, her hands shaking so badly the cups rattled against their saucers. She had wept until her eyes were dry and raw, and now found a fragile, desperate comfort in the familiar order of service. "I thought you might need this, Doctor, Mrs. Daggett said, her voice thick. "Thank you, Mrs. Daggett," Dr. Murray said kindly. "Please sit down for a moment. You shouldn't be rushing about right now." Mrs. Daggett collapsed into a small wooden chair by the door, folding her hands tightly in her apron. "He was a gentle soul, he was," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Never raised his voice to the staff, never demanded anything but his peace and his specimens. 4 hours every day he spent in that grotto, right up until the winter cold drove him indoors. Every single day, without fail. He knew every shell by name. You know, sometimes the electric lights would go out in a storm, and he would just keep walking through the folly. He could walk through the entire grotto in the pitch dark, and name each section just by the touch of the shells." "And his niece, Isabel?" Miss Marple asked mildly, pouring the tea and handing a cup to the housekeeper. "She assisted him, I understand?" "Oh, Miss Isabel was his right hand," Mrs. Daggett said, taking the cup with both hands to steady it. "She has a true gift, that girl. She could make a shell into anything she wished. Flowers, faces, geometric stars. She designed the great Neptune panel on the east wall entirely by herself. She lived for the work as much as he did. More, perhaps, lately." Miss Marple and Dr. Murray finished their tea quietly. Leaving the housekeeper to rest in the sanctuary of the collection room, they walked back out into the wide central hallway. They found Isabel in the small, sunlit morning room at the front of the house. She was sitting by the window, doing absolutely nothing. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, and this rigid stillness was the only visible sign of her distress. As they entered, Isabel rose to greet them. She was 32, dressed in a dark, severe wool skirt and a high-collared blouse. She was pale, possessing a quiet, arresting stillness that seemed to absorb the light around her. "Dr. Murray," Isabel said, her voice perfectly level, lacking the jagged edges of fresh grief. "Inspector Chard is asking for the medical records regarding my uncle's arthritis. I told him you might have them in your bag." "Of course, Isabel," Dr. Murray said. "I'll take them to him now. Are you holding up all right, my dear?" "I am perfectly well, thank you." She did not look toward the window. She simply stared straight ahead. "If you need anything else, I shall be here." Miss Marple watched her carefully. The composure was striking. It was not the blank shock of a grieving relative. It was the specific, careful, deliberate composure of someone holding a very heavy weight and terrified of dropping it. "She is taking it bravely," Miss Marple noted to Dr. Murray as they stepped back into the hall. Mrs. Daggett, who had followed them out to collect the tray, darkened at the words. Her grief suddenly gave way to a sharp, protective anger. "She's in shock, but it's that Martin who brought this trouble to the house. I know it in my bones." "Martin Haverly?" Miss Marple asked. "The nephew?" "Yes," the housekeeper said, her voice dropping to a harsh, conspiratorial whisper. "He was here on Tuesday. Shouting in the study he was. I was polishing the silver in the dining room, and I heard every word through the wall. He wanted money again. Mr. Reginald had given him loans twice before, cleared his gambling debts, though he swore it was for a business venture. But this time Mr. Reginald refused. He said the collection was his legacy, not Martin's bank. Martin stormed out, knocking over a side table and smashing a very fine porcelain vase. He stood in the hall and yelled that he'd see his uncle ruined if he didn't help him. He has terrible debts, you see. Desperate men do desperate things. It was an ugly, glaring detail, the sort of easily digested motive that a methodical man like Inspector Chard would seize upon immediately. And indeed, Chard was currently situated in the library down the hall, systematically reviewing Reginald's bank statements and correspondence, no doubt looking for exactly that sort of leverage. Martin Haverly was the obvious suspect. He was loud, he was angry, he was deeply indebted, and he had been publicly, humiliatingly refused. He looked very guilty from the start. But anger, Miss Marple knew from long experience, was loud. Murder was often something entirely different. It reminded her of a young curate she had known years ago in St. Mary Mead, who had always looked most terribly guilty when the collection plate came up short, sweating and stammering through his sermons, simply because he was terrified of being accused, though he had never taken a single penny. Guilt had a way of looking like innocence, and innocence had a way of looking exactly like guilt. Miss Marple left the hallway and walked out toward the grotto again, alone this time. The police were heavily occupied inside the house. She walked through the undamaged sections of the Folly. It truly was a marvel. The walls sang with careful, deliberate color, abalone and murex, cowrie and delicate scallop, arranged in sweeping, intricate patterns that must have taken months of painstaking, back-breaking labor. This was the work of a lifetime. Whoever had built this had loved it with a consuming passion. It was a place of profound, echoing peace. It was not a place built for violence. And yet, as she stood in the nave of the Folly, she remembered the gray, flat ugliness of the Portland cement sealing that alcove. The person who had rapidly mixed that mortar and built that wall in the dark had not been thinking of beauty at all. They had been thinking of nothing but survival. Chapter 3. The Folly and Its Maker. The lion's paw scallop, nodipectin nodosus, is fundamentally a building shell. It does not possess the smooth porcelain elegance of a cowrie, nor the delicate symmetry of a wenteltrap. Instead, it is defined entirely by its rugged, uncompromising architecture. Deep, heavy ridges run across its surface like the ribs of a vaulted cathedral ceiling, stained in rich, bruised oranges, deep purples, and earthen reds. For centuries, the great builders of shell grottos have used it structurally, relying on its strength and its striking claw-like shape to anchor arches and cornices, pressing them into mortar to bear the visual weight of entire walls. It is a foundational shell, worth perhaps 20 to 100 pounds, but invaluable to the physical integrity of a grand design. It represents the architecture of a thing. It is the solid, beautiful bedrock upon which other beauties are built. Reuben was working, or at least putting on a highly convincing pantomime of working, near the outbuildings later that afternoon. His face was still ashen with the morning's terrible discovery, and he kept pausing to lean heavily on his rake. He was a sturdy Devon gardener and builder of 20 years' standing on the estate, a man who possessed the quiet, solid dignity of physical labor. He had built half of the grotto himself, under Reginald's meticulous direction, and his pride in the work was both real and profound. Miss Marple approached him with the gentle, helpless manner of an elderly lady, simply seeking a moment's rest from the loud, heavy-booted commotion in the main house. "It is such an absolute marvel, Reuben, what you and Mr. Haverly achieved down there," she said, resting her hands lightly on the curved handle of her umbrella. "The sheer scale of it all. I confess, I cannot even begin to imagine the work involved. Those patterns on the ceiling, they must have taken years." Reuben looked up, visibly grateful for the gentle, respectful distraction from the police constables tramping through his dormant flower beds. "It was all his vision, ma'am," the gardener said humbly, taking off his cap. "I just followed his diagrams. But I'd be happy to show you if you like. The police say I can't go near the alcove, but the rest of it, well, it's safe enough." Miss Marple accepted the offer with a warm smile, and Reuben led her back down the gravel path to the arched entrance. As they stepped inside, the noise of the wind vanished, replaced by the profound acoustic silence of the limestone chamber. "Look up there, ma'am," Reuben said, pointing to the ceiling of the first antechamber. "That took us 6 months. The ceiling is inlaid entirely with cockles and blue mussels. Mr. Reginald insisted on it. Said they were from his very first seaside collection as a boy. We set them in a spiral pattern, like a great wave breaking. Had to work on scaffolding for weeks." Miss Marple looked up. The blue-black mussel shells and the pale-ribbed cockles swirled together in a mesmerizing, perfectly executed vortex. They moved deeper into the folly, past a magnificent archway lined entirely with thick, interlocking lion's paw scallops. They walked through a long connecting corridor where the walls were lined with mussel shells set into rigorous interlocking geometric patterns that shifted dynamically as they moved. "And this," Reuben said, his voice dropping into a tone of quiet reverence as they reached a large recessed panel, "the Neptune alcove. Miss Isabel did the figure herself. Took her the better part of a year. The figure of the sea god was astonishing. His beard was crafted from hundreds of tiny white tusk shells. His eyes were deep, polished cowries. The trident he held was fashioned from the sharp, elongated spines of murex shells. But it was the ceiling above the figure that caught the eye. It was completely tiled in shells, cockles arranged in tight, radiating spirals, intercut with heavy whelks set deep into the mortar like a Roman mosaic. And, in the very center, perfectly arranged, was a medallion of exquisite, delicate, precious wenteltraps that Isabel had set herself with painstaking precision. At the end of the corridor, the space opened into a small rotunda. The domed ceiling here was a masterpiece of graduated cowries and limpets, arranged meticulously by size, from the largest at the rim to the smallest at the apex. "She has remarkable patience," Miss Marple murmured, taking it all in. "And the mortar? How does it all hold together so perfectly?" "Ah, well, that's the secret of it," Reuben said, a touch of professional pride returning to his face. "I mix the putty myself. Pure lime and crushed shell aggregate. That's the traditional way. Slower to set, but it breathes, see? Lime breathes. Portland doesn't breathe. It takes days to cure right, you see. You have to keep it damp, press the shells in slow, let the stone breathe with it. But it holds forever. It becomes part of the rock." "Unlike that new section," Miss Marple murmured, her voice soft, almost entirely absent-minded. Reuben nodded, a deep, bitter frown creasing his weathered forehead. "That's right. Portland cement. Terrible stuff for a place like this." He stepped over to an edge where the new mortar met the old, running his rough thumb across the join. "Feel the difference, ma'am. The lime putty, it has a warmth to it." It was an imprecise word for a very precise sensation. The lime putty, mixed with the crushed shell aggregate, had a porous, slightly yielding texture that reflected the ambient light differently, softly. Portland cement simply swallowed the light. "And the color?" Miss Marple asked, watching him closely. "Dead," Reuben said flatly. "The lime is a warm cream like old bone. That Portland stuff is flat, dead gray, like the sky before a storm." "I see," she said. "And did Mr. Haverly ever mention this urgency to you himself? A man so particular about his traditional lime putty?" "Never a word, ma'am," Reuben said defensively. "He hated Portland cement. Swore blind he'd never have it on the estate. Said it was ugly, modern, soulless stuff. But Miss Isabel told me to use it last week. Said her uncle wanted that damaged alcove finished fast, before the spring damp got into it. Insisted he'd given the direct order. So I brought the heavy bags down from the shed. Didn't mix it, though. She said she'd handle the trowel work herself. Said she wanted the practice." Miss Marple nodded slowly, absorbing this. She turned her gaze back out the arched entrance, looking across the lawn toward a small, sturdy stone outbuilding that sat entirely apart from the main house, sheltered by heavy rhododendron bushes. Its windows were propped wide open, which was exceedingly odd, given how bitter and biting the coastal wind was on this cold March morning. Miss Isabel's workroom, Reuben offered, following the direction of her gaze. Her private studio for the shell work. She keeps the windows open, even in the dead of winter. Miss Isabel says the varnish fumes are bad for the shells. Says they cloud the finish if you don't air the room out. Which varnish does she use? Miss Marple asked, her tone conversational. I couldn't tell you the name, ma'am, Reuben shrugged. I just know it has a nasty bite to it. Something with a sharp smell, not like the shellac we use on the wood trim up at the house. Real sharp. I see, Miss Marple agreed amiably. She thanked Reuben for the tour and walked away, her steps slow and deliberate. She made her way closer to the stone outbuilding. She did not attempt to enter. The door was likely locked, and she had absolutely no wish to alert Isabel by being intrusive quite yet. But she stood near the open window, shielded from view by the heavy leaves of the rhododendron bush. The wind carried the scent outward from the dark interior. There was the smell of varnish, yes, the heavy, sweet, sticky scent of linseed and resin. But beneath it, cutting sharply through the sweetness, was something entirely different. Something that stung the back of the throat and burned slightly in the delicate tissues of the nostrils. A chemical scent, astringent and cruel. It was exactly as Reuben had said. A sharp smell, entirely unlike shellac. It was acid. She did not ask further questions of the gardener. She did not immediately march to Inspector Chard to alert the police. She simply stood in the cold, filing the open windows and the specific burning smell away in her mind, alongside the gray Portland cement and the single worthless periwinkle at the door of the grotto. The pieces were laying themselves out, one by one, waiting for someone to see the pattern. Chapter 4. A Question of Varnish. The flamingo-tongued snail, Siphoma gibbosum, is a small marine gastropod of tropical coral reefs, whose living appearance is a masterpiece of optical illusion. When alive and submerged in clear Atlantic waters, its body is wrapped in a vibrant fleshy mantle, patterned with brilliant orange-gold leopard spots, bordered in jet black. To a diver swimming over the reef, the creature appears dazzlingly ornate, a jewel among the sea fans. But the moment the animal dies, or when the mantle is withdrawn in distress, the living colors vanish instantly, revealing the underlying shell to be a plain, uniform, cream-colored porcelain cylinder entirely devoid of pattern or ornament. The beauty of the flamingo tongue is an external projection, an ephemeral disguise that exists only so long as the living tissue maintains it. In the shell trade, collectors who purchase dead specimens expecting to see the spotted glory of the living creature are inevitably confronted with a dull, unadorned reality. Isabel Haverly's formal interview with Inspector Chard took place in the morning room on Thursday, under the pale, watery sunlight of a Devonshire spring. Isabel sat upright in a high-backed walnut armchair, her hands clasped loosely in her lap, wearing a simple gray woolen dress with white linen collar and cuffs. Her composure was extraordinary. While Mrs. Daggett had wept uncontrollably into her apron, and the housemaids had gathered in frightened clusters by the scullery, Isabel answered every question with a calm, measured deliberation that sounded less like grief and more like a carefully rehearsed recitation. Uncle Reginald was entirely devoted to the grotto, Inspector, she explained, her voice low, musical, and steady. He spent every afternoon there, inspecting each arch and niche. The western wall had suffered from frost damage during the bitter winter of '47, and he had been anxious to restore the Neptune niche before the spring meeting of the county antiquarians. He often worked late into the dusk, mixing small batches of mortar himself. "And the Portland cement, Miss Haverly?" Inspector Chard asked, leaning forward over his notebook. "The builder, Reuben, tells me that your uncle never permitted modern cement in the Folly, insisting on traditional lime putty." Isabel's eyelids flickered once, a minute, almost imperceptible hesitation, before she smiled faintly. Uncle Reginald was a purist in theory, Inspector, but in practice, he was growing impatient. His arthritis troubled him in cold, damp weather, and the lime mortar took weeks to cure properly. He bought a sack of quick-setting Portland cement in Torquay last month, so that the backing would set before the frost returned. Reuben is an old man. He dislikes any departure from traditional methods, and Uncle Reginald preferred not to argue with him. Miss Marple, who sat quietly on the window seat knitting a soft mauve bed jacket, listened without looking up. But behind her spectacles, her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. She had known a schoolmistress in St. Mary Mead, Miss Emily Finch, who had always given explanations of extraordinary clarity and reasonableness whenever church funds went missing. Miss Finch's answers had been so perfectly structured, so completely airtight in their logic, that everyone had accepted them for years. It was only when Miss Marple realized that innocent people generally give muddled, emotional, and disorganized accounts of traumatic events that the truth had emerged. Absolute composure under suspicion is rarely a sign of innocence. It is the armor of someone who has thought through every possible question in advance. When Inspector Chard concluded his interview and stepped outside to consult with Constable Hicks, Miss Marple laid her knitting in her bag and rose unhurriedly. "My dear Isabel," she said gently, approaching the armchair, "you must be utterly exhausted by all these distressing enquiries. In St. Mary Mead, whenever there was great sorrow in a parish, I always found that working with one's hands was the greatest solace. Would it be an intrusion if I asked to see your studio? Dr. Murray tells me your shell artistry is quite celebrated in the county." Isabel looked up, a shadow of guarded calculation passing across her features, before she smoothed it into polite warmth. "Not at all, Miss Marple, if you don't mind the clutter of an active workshop. It is just across the courtyard in the old dairy." They walked together across the damp cobblestones of the stable-yard. The workroom was cold and stone-flagged, smelling sharply of wood varnish, dry shellac, and sea salt. But beneath those familiar scents, Miss Marple's keen nostrils detected a third odor, a thin, biting, acrid smell that stung the back of the throat like burning sulfur. It was an odor that had no legitimate place in a studio devoted to assembling decorative mosaics. Upon the long wooden bench, resting upon a circular mahogany plinth, stood a Victorian glass bell jar protecting 3 delicate porcelain-white spiral shells of exquisite beauty. "What remarkable specimens," Miss Marple murmured, stepping closer. "Are those not the precious Wenteltrap?" "They are," Isabel said quietly, standing just behind her. "Uncle Reginald's greatest treasures." Miss Marple looked at the shells, and then she looked at the rows of chemical flasks upon the shelf above the sink. The pattern was beginning to reveal its outlines. Miss Marple lingered for a moment by the garden gate, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the gravel path. The subtle chemical smell of hydrochloric acid and damp lime that lingered about the grotto entrance was a physical anomaly that troubled her orderly mind. In the garden at St. Mary Mead, Miss Hartnell had once attempted to remove moss from her stone bird bath using a strong vitriol solution, and the resulting sharp acidic vapor had killed 2 adjacent standard roses within 24 hours. For an elderly gentleman of fastidious habits, to employ industrial acid in a delicate decorative grotto was entirely contrary to nature, unless he was attempting to dissolve or test something whose composition defied ordinary tools. Chapter 5. The Workroom. The glory of India cone, known to marine biology as Conus milneedwardsi, is an elongated, sharply turreted cone shell of striking elegance, adorned with dense, overlapping tent-like triangular markings of chestnut and burnt amber across a pale porcelain body. In nature, cone snails are among the most venomous predatory creatures in the tropical oceans, possessing a modified radular harpoon loaded with potent neurotoxins capable of paralyzing fish instantly or penetrating a heavy canvas glove to deliver a fatal sting to an unwary diver. The specimen upon a collector's velvet tray displays nothing of this lethal heritage. Its dry, polished surface appears entirely benign, an object of harmless aesthetic devotion. In conchology, as in human affairs, the most deadly mechanisms are almost always cloaked beneath an exterior of symmetrical grace. The precious Wenteltraps upon Isabel Haverly's workbench sat beneath a Victorian glass bell jar, positioned upon a circular pedestal of turned mahogany to shield them from the ambient dust of the estate. The workroom itself was a detached stone outbuilding that had once served as a dairy in the 18th century. Its thick granite walls kept the interior damp and cold, even in the brightest spring sunshine, and the air was saturated with a complex cocktail of scents. The clean, chalky dust of pulverized limestone, the sweet amber smell of pine turpentine, and beneath them both, a sharper, more astringent vapor that stung the nostrils with a faint, metallic bite. Miss Marple approached the workbench with slow, respectful steps, her walking stick clicking softly against the flagstones. From the deep pocket of her gray woolen cardigan, she withdrew the small silver-mounted magnifying glass she carried for inspecting fine ecclesiastical needlework and examining faded entries in parish registers. She lifted the glass to her eye, bending slightly over the bell jar, as the afternoon light caught the specimens from the high north window. Under 5-power magnification, the exquisite spiral ribs of the central specimen revealed their secret. In a natural epitonium sclerae, the delicate costae grow with subtle, organic irregularities, microscopic variations in thickness and curvature caused by the tidal rhythms and temperature fluctuations of the living mollusk's environment. But upon the specimen before her, the spiral ridges were executed with a mechanical, relentless uniformity. Each rib rose to precisely the same height. The spacing between the whorls was calculated with geometric perfection. Furthermore, along the deep suture lines where the ribs met the body whorl, Miss Marple detected tiny microscopic pits, the characteristic chemical etching left when dilute acid bites into the crystalline structure of calcium carbonate. It was not a shell produced by the ocean. It was a sculpture produced by an artist wielding acid, fine pumice powder, and a jeweler's engraving tool. Miss Marple lowered her glass, her face a mask of mild grandmotherly appreciation. "Quite charming, my dear," she murmured to Isabel, who stood watching her from the doorway, with her arms lightly folded. "Such precision is rarely seen outside of a national museum. Where did your uncle acquire these particular examples?" "They came from an estate clearance in Cornwall 3 years ago," Isabel replied smoothly, without a fraction of hesitation. "Uncle Reginald was exceedingly proud of them. He considered them the finest examples of the species in private hands." "He had every reason to be proud," Miss Marple said softly. "The craft involved in their creation is truly astonishing." She looked around the studio, taking in every detail with quiet, unhurried scrutiny. On the side shelves stood rows of glass reagent bottles, methylated spirits, potassium carbonate, clear copal varnish, and 2 dark brown glass flasks with ground glass stoppers labeled acid, hydrochlor, dill. Beside the sink lay a small copper bath used for chemical immersion, its interior stained a pale, chalky green. In a wooden crate beneath the table, half covered by a sheet of newspaper, lay several dozen thick, heavy shells of common Pacific tiger cowries, their spotted surfaces partially ground down by a carborundum wheel. Later that evening, in the warmth of Dr. Murray's sitting room, Miss Marple sat watching the peat fire burn down to crimson embers. She explained nothing of the microscopic pits or the chemical etching to her friend, for she had learned long ago that premature revelations only serve to warn the guilty. But she asked Dr. Murray if she might write a private letter to an old acquaintance at the Department of Zoology at the County Museum, requesting an expert opinion on conchological morphology. "Of course, Jane," Dr. Murray said, handing her a writing pad and a bottle of ink. Though what a collection of old seashells has to do with poor Reginald's death is entirely beyond me. Shells, Elspeth dear, Miss Marple replied, dipping her pen into the ink, are very much like the people of St. Mary Mead. When you look closely at the surface, you discover that what appears to be nature is very frequently artifice. People spend a great deal of effort trying to appear as though they grew into their positions, when in truth they have merely carved themselves to fit. The trap was quietly being set. As Miss Marple prepared to leave the workroom, her gaze swept across the orderly rows of specimen drawers once more. The physical craftsmanship displayed in Reginald Haverly's collection was breathtaking in its precision. Yet the faint traces of modern Portland cement and dental plaster upon the mixing board told a silent, tragic story of artifice turned to deceit. When human skill was divorced from genuine passion and harnessed to the service of fraud, the resulting creation, no matter how flawless to the naked eye, carried within itself the seeds of its own exposure. Chapter 6. The Dealer's Records. The Junonia volute, Scapella junonia, is a heavy, spindle-shaped gastropod shell of cream and pale ivory, decorated with neat, geometric spirals of chocolate-brown square dots that resemble musical notation upon a sheet of parchment. Native to the deep offshore sandbars of the Gulf of Mexico, it rarely washes ashore intact. For generations, finding a perfect specimen along the barrier islands was considered the absolute pinnacle of beachcombing fortune, celebrated in American regional newspapers like the discovery of a gold nugget. Because it lives in deep oceanic waters, its presence in an English collection depends entirely upon commercial trade, maritime networks, and the specialized records of dealers. It is a shell whose rarity is fundamentally a matter of provenance and geography, reminding us that an object's value is often determined not by what it is, but by the distance it has traveled and the hands through which it has passed. Gerald Forsham's establishment, the Devonshire naturalist and antiquary, occupied a narrow, bow-fronted shop in the nearby coastal market town of Torquay. The shop interior was dark, cramped, and smelled intensely of methylated spirits, dry wood shavings, formalin, and powdered naphthalene. Glass-fronted display cases lined the walls from floor to ceiling, crowded with dried starfish, stuffed seabirds with glass eyes, trays of fossil ammonites, and row upon row of polished tropical shells arranged on beds of yellowed cotton wool. Forsham himself was a thin, nervous man of 50, with thinning ginger hair, rimless spectacles that continually slid down his nose, and ink-stained fingers that fluttered restlessly over his counter. "Miss Marple, Dr. Murray," he stammered, bustling forward from his back workshop, and hastily wiping his hands on a green baize apron. "What a terrible, shocking business at Thornwick Hall. Poor Mr. Haverly, a magnificent patron of the natural sciences. An absolute tragedy. I was only saying to my wife last night that the county has lost its finest conchologist." Miss Marple smiled with disarming, gentle vagueness, browsing the trays of common cowries near the till. She used to say that with the right preparation, any common shell could be made to look extraordinary. "You have been most illuminating, Mr. Forsham," Miss Marple replied, placing the volute back on its cotton bed. As they walked out into the crisp sea air of Torquay, Miss Marple noted the final piece of the sequence. Forsham had delivered the Sotheby's catalogue on Wednesday afternoon at 3 o'clock. Reginald had opened it, recognized the forged wenteltraps, and confronted Isabel less than an hour later. Dr. Murray steered her Austin saloon car with brisk efficiency along the winding coastal lanes that led from Torquay back toward Thornwick Hall. The afternoon sea fog was beginning to roll in from the English Channel, blurring the red sandstone cliffs and the dark green pines into ghost-like silhouettes against the pale sky. "Forsham was terrified, Jane," Dr. Murray remarked, keeping her eyes on the narrow road. "I have known Gerald Forsham for 15 years. He treats every country doctor and curate as though they were visiting royalty. But this afternoon, he looked as though he expected the police to march through his door with handcuffs. "Mr. Forsham is a very small cog in a very large wheel, Elspeth," Miss Marple replied, watching the salt spray mist the windscreen. "He makes a modest living selling preserved crabs to schoolboys and common cowries to amateur collectors. When a respectable tradesman realizes that his ordinary commercial stock has been used to facilitate a major felony, his first instinct is always to hide his ledgers and swear he knows nothing." "And the Sotheby's catalog?" Dr. Murray asked. "The one he delivered on Wednesday afternoon?" "That catalog was the catalyst for the tragedy," Miss Marple said gently, her voice dropping into a register of deep contemplation. "Reginald Haverly lived in a world of pure, unblemished scholarship. He loved his shells because they were natural, beautiful, and incapable of deceit. When he opened that catalog and saw 3 Devonshire estate Wentel traps listed with estimates of £6,000 each, he knew instantly that his name and his scientific reputation were being used to swindle London collectors." She looked at her gloved hands, resting quietly in her lap. He recognized the carving, Elspeth. He had watched Isabel at work in the dairy for 3 years, believing she was merely practicing her decorative engraving. In one terrible moment on Wednesday afternoon, the veil fell from his eyes. He realized that the niece he adored was a common fraud. "And Reginald was not a man to compromise with dishonesty," Dr. Murray said with a heavy sigh. "He would have confronted her immediately." "Yes," Miss Marple whispered, "and that confrontation was the beginning of his entombment." The quiet of the village lane outside the dealer's shop was broken only by the distant chime of the church clock striking the hour. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves, reflecting upon the peculiar blindness that so often afflicted passionate collectors. In her youth, she had known an old archdeacon who had collected medieval illuminated manuscripts with such fanatical zeal that he had purchased 3 blatant forgeries produced by a clever lithographer in Bristol, simply because the forged documents confirmed his own pet theories regarding the parish boundaries. Men saw what they desperately wished to see, and in that willing blindness lay the con artist's greatest profit. Chapter 7. What Martin Knew. The precious Wentel trap, known to conchology as Epitonium scalare, is a shell of almost architectural delicacy, its porcelain white whorls encircled by raised, paper-thin ribs that ascend like a spiral staircase to a sharp, flawless apex. In the late 18th century, it was considered the rarest and most prestigious specimen in European natural history cabinets, commanding prices equivalent to the cost of a substantial townhouse. Its fame was so great that craftsmen in Guangzhou and Canton perfected the art of counterfeiting it using compressed rice paste, producing replicas so cunningly textured that they deceived the leading collectors of London and Paris for decades. The Wentel trap has always been the shell that invited deception, proving that where human desire for rarity outstrips nature's supply, artifice will inevitably rush in to fill the void. Martin Haverly's alibi arrived at 11 o'clock on Thursday morning, in the form of a certified telegram from the secretary of the Devonshire Club in London, followed an hour later by a telephone call to Inspector Chard from Sir Arthur Pendleton, a retired judge of the Queen's Bench. Martin had indeed travelled to London on the preceding Tuesday, exactly as he had claimed. He had checked into the club at 4 in the afternoon, dined with Sir Arthur at 8, played bridge until midnight in full view of 12 members, and spent the entirety of Wednesday and Thursday morning in the club's library consulting financial solicitors regarding his debts. The hall porter's log, the dining room vouchers, and the telephone records all confirmed his presence without a single minute of unaccounted time. Inspector Chard folded the telegram with a heavy, frustrated sigh, leaning against the doorframe of the morning room, where Miss Marple was quietly winding a skein of soft grey wool. "Well, ma'am, that clears the nephew. He's an irresponsible young spendthrift, no doubt, but he was 200 miles away when his uncle was bricked into that wall. "Martin is certainly reckless with money, Inspector," Miss Marple observed mildly, her knitting needles clicking with a soft, hypnotic rhythm. "He borrows what he cannot repay, and quarrels loudly when he is refused. But people who make loud, theatrical scenes in front of witnesses rarely commit quiet, solitary murders. A man who shouts his grievances on the front lawn is discharging his passion. It is the person who swallows their grievance in silence, who smiles and adjusts their work, whom one must watch with great care." Chard scratched his chin. "You're thinking of Forsham, the dealer? He was nervous as a cat when I saw him yesterday." "Mr. Forsham is nervous because he is a tradesman who fears being entangled in a scandal that might ruin his business," Miss Marple replied. "He sold common stock, Inspector, nothing more. But there is someone in this house whose hands have been engaged in something far more intricate than gardening or restoration." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple joined Isabel Haverly in the sunlit conservatory at the south end of the hall. The March light fell pale and clear through the high glass panes, warming the potted geraniums and casting geometric shadows across the stone floor. Isabel sat on a wicker chair, her profile dark against the light, working on a delicate mosaic star constructed from tiny matching cockle valves. "You have such extraordinary dexterity, my dear," Miss Marple remarked gently, setting her teacup upon the wicker side table. "To select hundreds of shells of identical curvature and set them without disturbing the alignment requires a hand of remarkable discipline." "It is merely practice, Miss Marple," Isabel replied, her voice soft, composed, and completely even. "Uncle Reginald taught me when I was 12. He used to say that a shell will tell you where it wants to sit if you have the patience to listen." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "May I see your current piece? The symmetry is quite breathtaking." Isabel extended both hands, holding the wooden frame forward for inspection. Miss Marple looked not at the wooden frame, but at the fingers holding it. The fingertips bore the hard, polished calluses characteristic of a craftsman who spends hours pressing shell edges into setting putty. But, at the base of the fingernails, along the delicate rim of the cuticles, there were faint, chalky white discolorations, tiny, irregular patches where the skin had been bleached and pitted. It was not the gray dust of Portland cement, nor the warm amber stain of pine shellac. It was the unmistakable, corrosive signature of dilute hydrochloric acid, which attacks the keratin of human skin, exactly as it dissolves the calcium carbonate of a mollusk's shell. "Quite remarkable," Miss Marple said softly, looking up into Isabel's calm, watchful gray eyes. "Quite remarkable indeed." When Miss Marple returned to the morning room after her conversation in the conservatory, Inspector Chard was still pacing the Aubusson carpet, chewing the end of an unlit pipe. "Martin Haverly's solicitors in London have confirmed everything, Miss Marple," Chard said, turning as she entered. "The boy owes nearly £4,000 to various bookmakers and card clubs in Mayfair. His uncle refused to give him a single penny when they argued on the lawn last Sunday, but Martin had already made an appointment with a moneylender in the city for Wednesday afternoon. He was sitting in an office in Chancery Lane, signing promissory notes at the exact hour his uncle was being murdered in Devon." "A spendthrift, Inspector," Miss Marple observed, taking her seat by the window and picking up her knitting needles, "is always a very noisy, visible creature. In St. Mary Mead, we had young Tommy Simons, who ran up debts with every butcher, baker, and horse dealer in the county. Whenever his father refused to pay his allowances, Tommy would threaten to throw himself into the mill pond or run away to the colonies. Everyone in the village thought Tommy was capable of any desperate crime. But when the vicarage was actually burgled, it was not Tommy who had broken the lock. It was the quiet, respectable parish clerk, who had never raised his voice in his life." Chard took his pipe from his mouth. "You think the quiet ones are the dangerous ones?" "The quiet ones," Miss Marple said softly, "have nowhere to discharge their panic. A young man who shouts and breaks teacups gets rid of his anger. But a person who has spent 3 years living behind an elaborate facade of artistic devotion cannot afford a scene. When their secret is uncovered, they see their entire life dissolving before them in an instant. They do not shout, they strike. She looked out through the glass toward the dark silhouette of the grotto, nestled in the wooded coombe below the terrace. Isabel Haverly's hands, Inspector. Look at her fingertips when you speak to her next. The skin around her cuticles has been bleached white by acid. You will not find that bleaching on the hands of Martin, or Reuben, or poor Mr. Forsham. It is the signature of the workroom. Chapter 8. The Forger's Hands. The matchless cone, Conus Sidonulli, whose Latin epithet translates proudly to "I yield to none," was long considered the singular aristocrat of Caribbean shells. In 1796, at the celebrated auction of the collection of the King of Portugal's minister, a single specimen was sold to the King of Denmark for the astonishing sum of 300 guineas, outbidding Catherine the Great of Russia. For nearly a century, collectors believed that only one genuine specimen existed in the world, naming it matchless as an absolute declaration of supremacy. When subsequent dredging operations revealed that the species, while uncommon, existed in healthy colonies off St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the market price fell, but the romantic allure of its name remained. It is a cautionary lesson in the history of science. When human beings declare that something is unique and irreplaceable, they are usually describing their own ignorance rather than the abundance of the sea. The report from the Department of Zoology at the County Museum arrived on Friday morning, delivered by special messenger in a heavy linen envelope addressed to Dr. Murray. Dr. Murray broke the wax seal at the breakfast table, scanning the 2-page typed document, while Miss Marple buttered a slice of toast with unhurried precision. "Listen to this, Jane," Dr. Murray said, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "The specimen submitted for examination, purporting to be a rare juvenile of Epitonium scalar from a private Devonshire collection, exhibits conclusive evidence of artificial manufacture. The radial costae, or spiral ribs, have not been formed by the natural growth mantle of the mollusk, but have been mechanically carved and chemically etched from the thick body whorl of a common Pacific cowrie, Cypraea tigris. Microscopic inspection reveals uniform acid etching along the suture lines, consistent with the application of dilute hydrochloric acid, followed by an application of bleached shellac and barium white pigment to simulate natural porcelain luster. The technical execution is of an extraordinarily high order, indicating profound knowledge of conchological morphology and exceptional manual skill." Miss Marple nodded slowly, setting her knife down without a sound. "A forgery of genius. It explains everything, Elspeth. It explains the dealer's catalogue Reginald had circled in his study," Dr. Murray agreed grimly. "The London auction house was offering 3 Devonshire estate specimens, with estimates of £6,000 each. Reginald must have seen that catalogue, recognized the very shells he had watched Isabel preparing in her studio, and realized what his niece was doing." "Yes," Miss Marple said, her eyes darkening with sorrow. "Reginald Haverly spent 12 years building a monument to the natural beauty of shells. To discover that the girl he had raised, the niece he trusted above all others, was turning his beloved science into a common fraudulent trade, it would have broken his heart. And Reginald was an obstinate, principled man. He would never have permitted such a deception to stand." She turned to Dr. Murray. "Elspeth, my dear, when you examined Reginald for his arthritis in November, you noted a marked improvement in his mobility, did you not?" "I did," Dr. Murray replied, puzzled. The new gold salts treatment had relieved the inflammation in his knees considerably. He was walking without his cane for the first time in 3 years. "Which means," Miss Marple said quietly, "that Reginald was capable of walking down to the grotto alone, without leaning on Reuben or Isabel. He was capable of inspecting the new alcove unobserved. When he saw the auction catalog on Wednesday, he did not wait for the morning. He walked straight down to the Folly to confront her. The tragedy was now complete in its architecture. Miss Marple smoothed her napkin and folded her hands. The proof was in the acid on Isabel's fingers, the forged Wentel trap in the museum, and the Portland cement on the wall. All that remained was the reckoning. Miss Marple took the museum's typed report from Dr. Murray's hands and studied the attached forensic photographs with meticulous care. The high-contrast black-and-white plates showed microscopic close-ups of the shell's surface, the parallel striations left by a steel engraving burr, the minute craters where hydrochloric acid had dissolved the calcium matrix, and the thin, glassy film of synthetic resin applied to mimic the natural nacre of a living mollusk. "It is a truly extraordinary piece of forensic work," Miss Marple murmured, adjusting her spectacles. "The museum zoologist, Mr. Abernethy, has described the technique with wonderful precision. He notes that the counterfeit ribs were carved from the thick outer lip of a common Pacific tiger cowrie, which possesses exactly the required density of calcium carbonate." Dr. Murray shook her head in sorrow. To think that such remarkable talent was wasted on a criminal enterprise. Isabel could have been a celebrated artist in London or Paris. Why would she do it, Jane? She had a home here, an affectionate uncle, and an independent income. "The income, Elspeth dear, was not independent," Miss Marple replied gently. "Thornwick Hall is heavily encumbered with mortgages dating from the Great War. Reginald Haverly spent every spare penny of the estate's revenue on his beloved collection, purchasing rare specimens at auction while the roofs leaked and the farms deteriorated. Isabel was terrified of poverty. She saw her brother Martin drowning in gambling debts, and she saw the estate slipping toward ruin. She believed that by creating a few rare specimens for wealthy London collectors, she could save the family from bankruptcy without harming a living soul. She handed the report back to Dr. Murray. "It reminds me so much of poor Miss Clara Pettigrew in St. Mary Mead." Miss Clara began altering the dates on railway season tickets to save a few shillings for her invalid sister's medicine. She told herself it was an innocent, harmless deception that hurt no one. But crime is an appetite that grows with feeding, Elspeth. One small deception leads inevitably to a larger one, until finally the house of cards is so vast that when it begins to tumble, the person who built it will do anything at all, to keep it from falling. And when Reginald discovered the Sotheby's catalog, Dr. Murray said grimly, "The house of cards came down." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and the only way Isabel could stop the collapse was to ensure that Reginald never made that telephone call to London." The sitting room in the cottage grew quiet as the evening fire settled into glowing embers. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their soft, rhythmic clicking, her thoughts dwelling upon the tragic figure of Isabel. A lifetime of quiet subservience and unrecognized artistic talent, twisted by resentment and financial desperation into cold, systematic forgery, was a human tragedy as ancient as the rocks of the Devon coast. Greed alone rarely created a master forger. It required that deeper, darker hunger for artistic recognition that had been denied by a patronizing world. Chapter 9. A Sea Change. The glory of the sea, Conus Gloria Maris, is the crown jewel of conchology, a shell whose very name evokes the golden age of natural history exploration. For more than 2 centuries, it was universally regarded as the rarest and most valuable biological object on Earth. Between its initial discovery in 1777 and the mid-20th century, fewer than 3 dozen specimens were known to exist, each one catalogued in scientific journals and guarded in locked museum vaults like sovereign crown jewels. When a specimen appeared at auction in London in 1856, it was bought for a sum exceeding £16,000 in modern currency. Reginald Haverly had acquired his own specimen, a flawless 5-inch cone patterned with thousands of microscopic golden-brown triangles, like sunlight refracted through deep water. In 1938, housing it in a velvet-lined rosewood cabinet at the center of his collection room. It was the soul of Thornwick Hall. At 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon, under the supervision of Inspector Chard and the county coroner, 2 constables, equipped with heavy cold chisels and mallet hammers, began the physical excavation of the sealed alcove in the grotto's western wall. The sound of the steel chisels biting into the gray Portland cement was loud, rhythmic, and shockingly violent in the quiet, damp interior of the shell-lined chamber. With every hammer blow, small fragments of gray mortar fractured and fell to the shingle floor. Miss Marple stood near the entrance, wrapped in her heavy tweed traveling cloak, watching the work with grave, sorrowful stillness. Beside her, Dr. Murray stood with her medical bag in hand, her face pale. After 20 minutes of sustained effort, a large slab of the modern gray cement cracked along its bottom seam and was levered away with an iron crowbar. The dark, hollow recess behind it was revealed. The air that rushed from the opening was cold, stale, and heavy with the mineral scent of wet lime. Inside the narrow, arched alcove, slumped against the back wall of rough limestone, was the body of Reginald Haverly. He wore his heavy woolen gardening coat, his gray woolen scarf still wrapped loosely around his neck. Inspector Chard stepped forward with a powerful electric torch, directing the yellow beam into the recess. He knelt beside the dead man with professional solemnity, performing the necessary formal examination. In the right-hand pocket of Reginald's overcoat, Chard's fingers closed upon a small, red leather-bound notebook, its corners curled with damp. "Bring it into the light, Inspector," Dr. Murray whispered. They carried the notebook to the arched opening of the grotto, where the afternoon sun fell across the pages. Chard turned the leaves carefully. The handwriting was Reginald's neat, scholarly script, written in dark fountain pen ink. The final entry, dated Wednesday, March 18th, was inscribed in a hand that trembled with profound agitation. 1:30 in the afternoon. Catalogue received from Sotheby's. Lot 44. 3 specimens of Epitonium scalare, Devon provenance. Examined under microscope. There is no doubt. The acid work is identical to the experimental pieces Isabel produced in the workroom last November. She has been selling forged rarities under my name. 3:45 in the afternoon. Confronted Isabel in the morning room. She attempted to laugh it off as a harmless diversion, then broke down when I showed her the museum comparison. She begged me to say nothing, claiming she needed £22,000 to settle Martin's gambling debts in London and secure the estate's mortgage. I told her that truth cannot be purchased with lies. I informed her that I would telephone the Shell Collectors Society tomorrow morning at 9 to retract the provenance and tender my resignation. She must face the consequences of the law. 4:30 in the afternoon. Placed call through Village Exchange to request the Society's London number. Line engaged. Will try again from the house after inspecting the repairs at the grotto. Inspector Chard closed the leather notebook, his jaw set in a hard, grim line. She heard him place that call from the morning room. She knew that in 16 hours her entire world would collapse. She followed him down here with the cement and the trowel. "Yes," Miss Marple said, her voice dropping into a quiet that was more terrible than anger. She made one decision in panic, and the stones of the grotto did the rest. The excavation was complete. The evidence was undeniable. Miss Marple turned and walked slowly toward the house, to meet the woman who had built a prison of shells. The salt breeze drifting through the open window brought with it the eternal rhythm of the surf breaking upon the shingle beach. Miss Marple looked at the delicate porcelain tea service upon the table, her mind reviewing the complete sequence of events with calm, unsparing clarity. Every false clue, every forged shell, and every drop of acid had been deployed with meticulous care, Yet like all human deceptions, the elaborate structure had cracked at its weakest point. The physical impossibility of modern cement coexisting with 18th-century lime. Chapter 10. The Shell That Counted. We return, finally, to the European common periwinkle, Litorina litoria. It is the same dark, heavily whorled, unremarkable shell from the very first chapter. It is entirely worthless commercially. It is the commonest shell on any English shore, carpeting the tidal pools in their uncounted millions, ignoring the tides. It was the shell Reginald Haverly picked up as a boy of 8 on a freezing Cornish beach half a century ago. It was the absolute beginning of everything he built. It was the foundation of his aesthetic, the quiet, humble anchor of his entire collection. And it is a profound, quiet reminder that when all the brilliant, venomous, beautiful, and matchless things are stripped away by time and by truth, we are left only with what is ordinary. We are left with the things that are common, which are also the things that are true. Miss Marple set her pace carefully as they walked down the long corridor toward Isabel's part of the house. Beside her, Inspector Chard moved heavily, his regulation boots striking a hard, rhythmic beat against the flagstones, a sound that echoed down the quiet hallway like a ticking clock. Miss Marple's steps were soft, almost silent in comparison, but she moved with absolute, unwavering purpose. Through the tall, arched windows lining the corridor, the grotto was visible against the cliff edge in the fading afternoon light. It retained its overwhelming sweeping beauty, standing firm against the battering wind coming off the channel. But from this angle, the sealed section was still faintly visible, the harsh utilitarian gray of the Portland cement standing out like an ugly healing scar against the soft, breathing cream of the original lime putty. They did not find Isabel hiding. She had not packed a bag. She had not fled down the coastal path. They found her sitting in the small, glass-walled morning room, the heavy oak door standing open. She was sitting in a high-backed chair, with a small, intricate piece of shellwork resting in her lap. She possessed the intense, focused calm of a person who has been waiting in the dark for a very long time for something terrible to happen, and who is almost profoundly relieved that the waiting has finally come to an end. Miss Marple entered the room first. She did not allow Inspector Chard to take the lead. She moved forward and sat down in the chair opposite Isabel before the policeman could begin his formal recitation. "I wonder," Miss Marple said gently, leaning forward slightly, "if I might see what you are working on, my dear." Isabel looked down at her hands, then slowly extended the piece across the small table. It was a delicate, geometric star, fashioned from tiny, pearl-white tusk shells and the polished backs of cowries. "It is very beautiful," Miss Marple said softly, tracing the air above the pattern with a gloved finger. And she meant it entirely. The tragedy was not that Isabel was untalented. The tragedy was that her talent was immense, and she had chosen to use it in the dark. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Isabel," she said, her voice dropping into a quiet, conversational tone that somehow held the entire room hostage. "I wonder if you could tell me about the mortar mix you used for the restoration in the alcove. It seemed, when I looked at it closely, to be a rather different composition from the original, a much faster-setting mixture." Isabel looked up, her dark eyes entirely steady. She did not feign ignorance. "It was Portland cement," she answered smoothly, her voice a quiet murmur. "Uncle Reginald wanted the damp sealed out quickly before the spring rains arrived. The lime putty takes far too long to cure in this weather." "I see," Miss Marple nodded, apparently satisfied. "A practical decision, of course." "And the workroom. I noticed when we were there, quite apart from the heavy scent of the shellac, something sharper, a deeper smell. I thought at the time it might be some sort of industrial cleaning agent." "What do you use to prepare the specimens before varnishing?" Isabel's hands tightened fractionally on her lap, a microscopic flinch. "I use a variety of solvents," she replied, her voice remaining careful, slightly too technical, the voice of an expert delivering a lecture. "Depending on the calcium structure of the shell. Dilute acids are sometimes necessary to remove organic buildup and calcification before the final polish." "Hydrochloric acid?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Sometimes, in very weak solutions." "Yes," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "It can be very effective, I understand, but very hard on the hands over the years. Even weak solutions. It damages the nail bed so terribly." Isabel did not look down at her hands. The silence in the morning room stretched out, taut as a piano wire. "Your uncle made a telephone call at 4:30 on Wednesday afternoon," Miss Marple said, her voice softer now, almost infinitely gentle. "The local operator's record shows he was asking for the Shell Collectors Society's London number. Did you hear him making that call from the hallway?" The silence stretched again. The wind rattled the glass in the window frames. "Yes," Isabel said, the single word dropping into the room like a stone into deep water. "I heard him." Miss Marple sighed, a sound of profound, weary sadness. "There was a woman I knew once, in St. Mary Mead," she began, leaning back in her chair. "A Mrs. Penrice. She was the wife of the local bank manager. She had been quietly forging her husband's signature on checks for a number of years. It was a small, manageable deception at first, paying a dressmaker's bill, covering a minor debt, but it grew. When he finally discovered it, he confronted her in his study. He was a rigid, unforgiving man, and in that moment she did the one thing that seemed possible to her. She picked up a heavy brass paperweight. She was not, I think, a wicked woman by nature. She was simply a woman who had made one terrible decision too quickly, under far too much pressure, because she could not bear the collapse of everything she had built, and she could not find her way back from it. I believe that is what happened here." Isabel closed her eyes. The shellwork star in her lap slipped slightly, falling to the carpet with a soft, muffled sound. "Does it matter?" Isabel whispered, her voice finally breaking, fracturing under the immense weight of the truth. "That I hadn't planned it? He was in the alcove. The heavy bags of mortar were right there. The trowel was in my hand. He told me he was going to ruin me. I just panicked. I just wanted the threat to stop." "To the law, no," Miss Marple said softly, shaking her head. "To me, rather a great deal." She sat back in her chair, signaling that her part in the terrible play was concluded. Inspector Chard stepped forward immediately, his voice heavy and formal as he began the recitation of her rights, placing a heavy hand on her shoulder. In the doorway of the morning room, Mrs. Daggett appeared, a silver tray in her hands. She stopped dead, staring at Isabel, understanding arriving on her face in a sudden brutal wave that made her sag against the doorframe. Dr. Murray, who had waited outside in the corridor, stepped forward to catch the older woman by the arm. The formal procedures took over the house, efficient and unyielding. The estate settled into an unnatural, heavy quiet. An hour later, as the police motor cars drove away up the long gravel drive, taking Isabel to the county station, Miss Marple and Dr. Murray walked slowly back down the sloping lawn, through the bitter wind, to the grotto. They stood together in the vast echoing silence of the limestone chamber. Miss Marple paused at the entrance, leaning lightly on her umbrella. She looked at the single dark periwinkle set into the brass pin by the door. It was a tragedy of immense proportions, a genuine talent that had curdled in the dark. It was the specific cruelty of forgery as a crime. It was a crime committed against the very thing you purported to love. Isabel had loved shells, had understood their architecture better than anyone, and she had used that brilliant understanding to make them into lies. The grotto was still beautiful, even so. The sweeping mosaics of the ceiling would stand for a century. But Reginald Haverly had trusted most the person who had the greatest reason to betray him. He had died because of a single terrible decision that could never ever be unmade. Miss Marple looked at the periwinkle. It was the most common shell in England. It was the one he had picked up first. He had never needed anything rarer than that to begin. It is enough sometimes simply to begin. She turned away from the grotto, taking Dr. Murray's arm, and together they walked back toward the house. We build our lives carefully, piece by piece, shell by shell, creating beautiful, intricate facades that we hope will stand the test of time. But sometimes, what we build is fragile, held together by nothing more than the desperate hope that no one will ever look too closely. I asked you at the beginning of this story about what we build and what we are willing to destroy to protect it. Isabel Haverly possessed a genuine, brilliant talent. She could have been an artist of renown, but she corrupted that talent in a single moment of absolute panic. She destroyed a gentle man who had trusted her most in all the world, all to protect an illusion built entirely on acid and common cowries. The grotto still stands on the Devonshire coast, a beautiful, tragic monument to a passion that went too far. I would love to hear your thoughts on this story. Do you think Isabel's panic makes her crime any less terrible? Or does the betrayal of her uncle's life's work make it worse? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them. Subscribe if you haven't already, so the next story finds you. There are more to come. There always are. This is David. Good night from Ohio. When something is called matchless, always examine it closely.